We acknowledge, celebrate, and pay our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First People on whose traditional lands we meet and work. Their cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We also acknowledge and celebrate that many of the speakers in this series were based on other traditional lands and territories across Australia and the world. We recognise their past and present leaders and acknowledge their contribution to our collective past and futures. Welcome to Cybernetics Snacks, a speaker series featuring leading voices in the cybernetics conversation. We're currently exploring the past, present, and future of cybernetics. Ethnographic practice, industry application, and cybernetics. Today, we're in conversation with Alex Zafiroglu. We've asked Alex 4 questions. Let's get into it.
So I, of course, want to be slightly contrarian and say why cybernetics with a small c, and note that it's not why cybernetics with a capital C. And I tend to gravitate to the lowercase versions of words that have capitalized versions that generally have more restricted meanings and more structure or more rules about how they can and may and should be used. And those uppercase versions tend to be perhaps a topic of interest to me. So culture with a capital C, or Catholic Church with a capital C versus Catholic with a small c, or etiquette with a small e versus etiquette with a large e. But I think it's never what informs or drives how I orient myself in the world, those kind of large letters. It's always the small ones. And I think this is because, in the words of my first PhD advisor, the late George Hicks, he always admonished to never argue from authority, never just say something is the way it is because somebody else said it. And that those capitalized versions of culture and etiquette, and of course, most importantly, cybernetics, are really those world of authority. And I think it's sometimes useful to think with and to engage with those worlds, but it's never where I feel most comfortable and centered. And without going into too much detail about who I am, I do want to set the stage a little bit for my answer to why cybernetics with a small c, to tell you that I grew up in a household of 4 siblings, raised in a first-generation American household. My father grew up in Istanbul, or Constantinople, as he always has and always will call it, his hometown. My father's people are Greeks with longstanding roots in Constantinople, in Konya, in the villages above Gallipoli, and in Odessa. My mother's people are from Gävle, Sweden, with longstanding roots in Dalarna, Gästrikland, and some Huguenot mixed in there. We were originally a trilingual household, but by the time that I came around, we were down to Swedish and English. I grew up in a situation in which I was always exquisitely aware that there were many ways of experiencing the world, and also many kind of frictions between different ways of thinking and being in the world, whether that was my mother's way, my father's way, or the larger American society in which I found myself. I went on to university and I studied cultural anthropology and archaeology. And this, of course, is anyone who is studying anthropology will say that is a spider's web and immediately go, oh, you're referring to Clifford Gertz and his famous quote that, and I am quoting him, and I would update it, but he said, "Man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun." And those webs of significance are what he was calling culture as a system of meanings, and meanings that can be contested, or meanings that are always being reproduced in the moment and reproduced over time. And he's also said a couple of other interesting things besides the gender mix-up that he has there. One is that we are animals, so that we are both like biological and cultural, and we're in this world and in our heads, and that these are webs of significance we have spun ourselves. So the meaning that we make in the world and the way that we come to the world and experience the world is very much based on the facilities that we have. And as an undergrad, I think there were a few things that really struck me, or works that really shaped who I was. So I don't think I thought of myself as a cybernetician because I didn't know that word. The first book was Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History. This is actually the first book that I bought myself as an adult at age 18. I'd gone to the bookstore to buy books with money that my parents had provided for me for textbooks. And I bought this book with the money that I had made working the summer before university. And it really taught me how to think about the world not in categories. I had been taught to recognize like Europe and so-called primitive societies, or with the idea that there's a fiction of static societies and dynamic societies, but that the world was one of constant change of material and economic exchange that had been happening for thousands and thousands of years in human societies. So kind of good Marxist background there. And then the second book also, building on Marxist anthropology, of course, is Sweetness and Power, which is Sid Mintz's book about the multiple histories and entanglements of people and political, economic, and cultural systems around the cultivation of a particular plant species, and mainly cane sugar. And this really taught me about how to think both at the level of the very specific and how relationships between people and other species shape things at kind of really like granular household, society, national levels, as well as global levels. Of course, Mary Douglas and her work around purity of danger, which I believe made my first cohort of PhD students read their first year, even before they started PhD work, was really also influential in helping me think about categories and systems as sense-making tools rather than reflecting universal truths. And then, of course, the last one that really shaped me is Stephen Lansing's Priests and Programmers, which blew my mind. That came out the year I was a third-year uni student. So there's 4 years of undergraduate in the US. It was my third year. And it completely liquefied any ground I had been on that I thought was stable around linear time, around simple exchanges, and made me start thinking in the multi-temporal and in the idea of complex systems that were around and present and shaping what we were doing, even if I didn't recognize them directly. It wasn't really until I got into graduate school that I had my first real encounter with a cybernetician, and that would have been Stuart Brand and his book, How Buildings Learn. Came out the year I started what here in Australia we call postgraduate studies. And I still have that book, and it still has tons of little papers, bits in it. And the one thing that really struck me in there was that his quote around all buildings are predictions and all predictions are wrong. And that one stays with me all of the time because it's a way of thinking about both stability and change over time, and that time was what was important and not structures. I ended up in graduate school taking a little bit of time off and working at the World Game Institute. So the next self-described cybernetician I bumped into was Buckminster Fuller. Of course, he had passed away by that time, but I took a year off between master's and PhD studies and found myself in Philadelphia, where I was working at a bakery and reading Moby Dick for the ethnographic detail about on-ship whale processing, which is fascinating for anybody who ever wants to learn about that. And I was craving more. I ended up working for a very short period as a researcher for the World Game Institute, which was Bucky's not-for-profit that was dedicated to educational outreach and teaching systems thinking and thinking in extraordinarily long time scales, and in questioning how we're taught to perceive the conditions and the challenges we face and how we can work together to create more just and equitable futures. So if anyone's ever played the World Game, you get in a really big room, you have a timeline where you're asked to think about how much time have humans spent on Earth compared to the age of the planet. And it's like this tiny little bit at the very end. He also introduced me to the Dymaxion projections of the world, which you're seeing here, and just a really different way of thinking about what you think is stable in the world and what really isn't. And of course, his quote around, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And of course, that's also like Kuhnian paradigm shifts and things like that. But that really kind of struck me as like, okay, if you want to make change, you have to think in systems, you have to think in really long time frames, and you have to think about not accepting the status quo. And this gets me to how I really came to cybernetics. And I'm going to ask for a little indulgence while I play a video. It's very, very short. And then afterwards, I'll talk about it. So I'm hoping you could hear a little bit of sound in there. Yesterday, my colleague Chris Misiku came by and said, "Are you playing classical music?" And I said, no, not quite. And I want to tell you a little story about this. This is something that I have written out, and I don't always like to read things. In fact, I really dislike people that read things, but it's a particular argument that I'm making, so I'm going to ask for your indulgence. So what you just watched is what is called a musical highway. And in April 2015, in a stretch of old Route 66 outside Albuquerque, a road sang to me and sang through me. Of course, the road itself did no such thing. The melody, America the Beautiful, so that's what you were hearing, America the Beautiful, resonated in the sense of to resound or to be filled with sound, audibly and through vibrations traveling from my feet to my lower body and up my back as I passed over a quarter-mile stretch of the road in a rental car at exactly 45 miles per hour or 72.4 kilometers an hour. And frankly, it tickled. For me, the experience was not a mere parlor trick. The musical highway did more than resonate my lower spine. It reverberated 25 years of training and professional practice in sense making and shaping new possibilities for how we, and here I mean people, create our built environments, the artifacts we fill them with, and how we define and act with one another and with other species, with the histories and the memories we bring to bear and the relationships among these parts and the meanings that emerge through their connections. So that system that I just showed you is ostensibly quite simple. There's a built environment, which is that paved road, some artifacts like the rental car, and some people. There needs to be at least one driver and perhaps some passengers. In this case, I promise you I was the passenger making the video, not the driver. And they need to be following some expectations for how they act, that the road needs to be stable, the driver needs to move the car at exactly 45 miles per hour in a particular direction across a rumble strip or a series of corrugations in the road. And a phenomenon that wasn't there, that melody emerges. If the musical highway was kind of just this, if my sense making were limited to thinking about that reverberations, if I wasn't curious about how the highway embodies an approach to do possibilities for how we live, then yeah, it would have been a quickly forgotten amusement. Or maybe it would have been a useful example for design in an undergraduate system or civil engineering course. But instead, because I recognized that my presence and my actions actively created a simple set of interactions that was itself enabled by and part of many other open, complex systems in which agency is present and potential in many actors, including me, including the car, that experience has become a useful example to illustrate my cybernetic mindset. And in 2015, I wasn't fluent in that language of cybernetics, though my internal monologue in response to my own question of what the heck is happening here would easily be recognizable in the cybernetics influenced social science in which I was trained. So Clifford Gertz, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Lewiston Sharp, Julian Stewart, Marvin Harris, Mary Douglas, Sid Mintz, and Eric Wolf. Later, Daniel Miller and Anna Halpton Singh and Nigel Thrift and Donna Haraway. That simple feedback loop involving the road corrugation, the driver behavior, and the vibrations and the vehicle speed that steers the driver, pun intended, towards a desired goal, producing that melody, are themselves reverberations in other multi-scale feedback loops and diffused agency in the Nora Bateson sense of that, and other Gertzian webs of significance were continuously both spinning and which were necessarily entangled. So what are some of these? They are bounded and expansive and specific to that time and place and extensible to others. Could I answer what's happening here without considering that I was in New Mexico and the New Mexico Department of Transportation was likely wanting to slow speeding drivers and in turn prevent crashes and collisions resulting in deaths of all sorts of animals, including reptiles and birds and mammals, including humans and cars and pedestrians and cyclists? Could I have made sense of this without understanding that 45 miles per hour is the speed limit and why speed limits exist? and that this unit of measure makes sense to some drivers, those in the Americas, and with car dashboards that measure speed in miles per hour, not kilometers per hour. And could I have understood what was happening without understanding that that melody that was being played was originally a poem about Colorado, which I can tell you is not New Mexico, and that it was written by the first female professor at Wesleyan, Professor Catherine Bates, and later set to music as a hymn, and was considered the closest thing to a national hymn that the US has, with the Kennedy administration in the 1960s trying to give it such a legal status as a national hymn. Didn't work. And finally, could I make sense of this without acknowledging that by 2021, that road no longer sings, that the friction of thousands and thousands of car vehicle tires, the New Mexico sun and heat, and the cold led first to decidedly off-tune renditions, which I think I cut off at the end because it goes wah, wah. But eventually just to silence. The Department of Transportation's original partner organization, the National Geographic Society, didn't really see any value in its upkeep. And so it doesn't exist anymore. It was a moment in time, a system in time. And I found that no, I couldn't have satisfactorily understood what was happening on that road unless I encountered those less tangible and immediate reverberations. And so that's how I think about cybernetics. Cybernetics is about asking all of those stories and understanding all of those valences and all of those feedback loops, and not just the physical ones. When I reached the end of that rumble strip, I quizzed my kids about what was happening and why and why and why. And in doing so, I was teaching them to think and see in systems, and that systems are not abstractions, but are tangible. They're grounded and they create frictions, past, present, and future. I taught them to look for frictions and explore them and to think in relationships. And I've taught them to recognize stability as a perspective, and that considering any topic for multiple starting points is more satisfying and more generative of understanding than adherence to an orthodoxy. And I taught them never to argue from authority, but to reason with knowledge, observation, and imagination. And to me, that is what cybernetics is. I had spent the better part of the prior years the 4 years prior to this ticklish serenade researching automobility in 8 countries for Intel and creating futures for autonomous driving and advanced distributed computing systems, including smart toilets, as you see there. And doing it in collaboration with strategists, with designers and computer scientists, engineers, and system developers at Intel and with Intel customers. And my point here is that doing all of these things, I was being a 21st century cybernetician and not just a social scientist. One in which I was learning how to, what Donna Haraway would say, is staying with the trouble, to not fall for kind of technology fantasies about how the world will be in the future, but to work in the here and now to shape systems towards safer, more sustainable, and more responsible ends with the values and capabilities and conditions that we have now. And all the while I was doing this at Intel for 15 years, I was using those types of questions I've asked about the musical highway in how I was thinking about products and services that would extend how we react and engage with the world in many ways. I know there's another set of questions, and I'm going pretty long already, so I'm going to let you go to the next set of questions, Amy.
Okay, I'm very happy to just continue to listen, Alex. In a way, I feel like you've answered all the questions already, but I'll continue to ask them and because we've got more time. The second question for us really related to cybernetics past and your favorite tool or approach or theory or text or person or story, interpret that however you will, from cybernetics and why.
Yeah. And so, Amy, now I'm going to mess with your sequencing.
That's ideal.
Chronology, and say, again, like similar to messing with your question about like why cybernetics with a big C, I want to talk about pasts and presents and futures, not past, present, and future. And the reason that I'm doing this is that I'm interested in this idea of conferencing that you're seeing on this slide, the kind of act of relating present moments to absent ones. So other present moments or other moments yet to come or other moments that have already come. So various pasts and various futures. And I'm inspired in this by a work from 2019 by two German early modern history scholars, Landwehr and Winterling, who talk about chronism or chronism as our relationships to time and how we connect present times to absent times. That's kind of conferencing idea. And so for each of these past, presents, and futures, I want to give a little example of how I'm thinking about things from the past, things in the present, and things in the future. So for that first one, I want to talk a little bit about two ideas that inspire me, sharing layers and verbs rather than nouns. So many of you may already be familiar with DEGWs, the innovative architecture firm in the early 1970s, idea of sharing layers, that a building, that kind of most solid of structures, is nothing more than compositions of many layers of change. And they identified four: shell, services, and scenario, or shell, service, scenery, and set. And I first encountered this in How Buildings Learn, when Stuart Brand quotes Duffy, the D in the DEGW, as saying, our most basic argument is that there isn't any such thing as a building. A building properly conceived is several layers of longevity of built components. I still love that. I still think it is a way of seeing stable things in the world as not quite as stable as we may perceive them. And Brand, of course, extended this to 6 layers: site, structure, skin, services, space plan, and stuff. And then, of course, he built on that to the PACE layers of change that include fashion, commerce, infrastructure, governance, culture, and nature. And this was really, really important for a step in opening my thinking as a cybernetician. And I've been thinking a lot about it lately, in particular around this idea of thinking in verbs rather than nouns. And this is a little something that I've been thinking about lately. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading again, but hopefully not too much. Because it's how I've been thinking about systems. Our worlds are a kaleidoscope of systems, overlapping, occasionally interlocking, and ever present, ever in motion. Experiencing the world as continually dynamic arrangements of elements is fundamental to cybernetics as a radical epistemology of systems thinking, right? And this is how Thomas Rid refers to Turner referring to like Batesian second order cybernetics, which is how I see my cybernetics. As a type of systems thinking, our cybernetics conceives the world as arrangements of elements relating to one another, and through such relations, forming wholes, manifesting purpose and emergent properties and behaviors. As a radical epistemology within systems orientations, we generate descriptions and explanations and predictions that foreground the dynamic relationships that generate current elements over above the emphasis on the elements themselves. So to put that more simply, we're focusing on verbs over nouns, right? So less about like the things that are present, but how do we get there? And I'm inspired by this in Mary Catherine Bateson's account of the late 1960s conference on the theme, The Effects of Conscious Purpose on Human Adaptation. Anatole Holt proposes printing bumper stickers that read, "Help stamp out nouns," as a rallying cry for transformation in how we think. And this stance may have made for a catchy tailgate or tailgate reading 50 years ago or a meme now. It's really quite radical and confounding and provocative. And it's really difficult to imagine not having any nouns anymore, just having verbs, particularly in English. And yet I find a great deal of sense in that provocation, because he argues what has to change is our fascination with nouns to be replaced by a fascination with process, which does not depend on a prior conception of a set of entities. So how do you take that like DGW, like everything is in flux, everything is moving through time, and apply that to how we see the world all of the time? And so when I think about how I'm doing that presently, and I see Amy's trying to ask me a question, so I'll stop for a second.
No, carry on.
Okay. So the second thing that I want to say is like, how do I actually do this now? And what is a a cybernetic concept that I'm engaging with in the present. This is really, I'm thinking through how do we see stereoscopically in time? So not stereoscopically just in the present of being able to see depth in the present, but to be able to see depth in time. I'm doing a research project within a research program that I'm running called the Cybernetics of Rapport and Attentiveness, or CORA for short. The project is called Arts and Agents, and it's with the Australasian Dance Collective, with a dance performance with performers that are both human artists and tiny quadcopter drones. And a performance of this takes an hour and 62 onstage performers. Of these, 6 of the starring roles are the human artists, and another 5 starring roles are shared across scenes by 56 other tiny quadcopter drones. And my argument is that all of the performers, so both human and drone, bring to that production many years of training in specialized capabilities of awareness of space and how to move within a space. They're all really have participated in months of collaborative exploration, experimentation, and training to stabilize the final presentation. And they are all attuned to one another's presence and actions in the onstage world, demonstrating a mutual attentiveness that animates their affect. And by affect, I mean their outward expressions of emotion and their expressions of rapport, or their relationships of mutual understanding. And in order to understand how this happens, we have to think beyond the real time of real-time computing to other times or other timed explorations of what's happening in this here and now moment, in part because those drones are performing pre-programmed flight paths. So they're not reacting in what we would consider the real time of human experience, even though real time refers to the computational system, it's really about how humans perceive it. And I make an argument around being able to see stereoscopically in time to perceive depth in time and not just in space, and how those relationships come together, and how we learn to perceive the present moment in multiple other time scales. That in attending to each other in the present, they've also been attending to each other for longer periods of time. And I see we have another 2 minutes, so I want to end with how I'm thinking about the future of cybernetics. And that is to say, I want us to be able to mind our T's and mind our X's. And here I'm riffing on the idea of minding your P's and Q's, or paying attention to and embodying practices of etiquette, and here with a small e instead of a large E, and embracing generative friction. And what are some of the ways of engaging and behaving that cyberneticians may value? And I convened the PhD program in the School of Cybernetics, and I spend a lot of time thinking about how we're producing the next generation of thinkers and doers and cybernetic researchers. And I'm keenly aware that we're not out to invent cybernetics anew, but to innovate, to connect, to generate frictions, rather than smooth them away. And I've been thinking about the types of thinkers and doers our PhD students are and how we're training them. And I've really moved away from the metaphor of a kind of T-shaped individual, people with deep knowledge and expertise in a discipline area that can kind of reach across and know enough about other things to engage or translate. And I think rather we should be striving to create X-shaped researchers, ones with kind of a core of trading and a traditional, perhaps disciplinary area, but with that desire to kind of reach out like spread eagle in that X shape in multiple directions, and to loop knowledge back into their core and to explore those frictions and learn from them. And an X shape has more surface area with which to encounter other ways of knowing and ways of doing, and more opportunities to generate friction. And so what I see as most important for cyberneticians is being open to multiple ways of knowledge and learning to embody those, and learning that as we create the next generation of researchers and cyberneticians, that these are folks that are going to end up in many, many different organizations, and learning to talk and to think across knowledge systems is incredibly important. And I will leave it there.
Want more? Check out the snack pack at the link below for bonus content and resources.